tardes, good afternoon to all. Vamos a empezar la siguiente ponencia invitada. So we are going to start with the next speaker, and she's Ayelet Lushkov. She's the author of this book, You Win or You Die, The Ancient World of Game of Thrones. She's from Texas University in Austin. Regrettably, she couldn't be here in person with us, but she has sent her presentation, and then she will be available through Skype for questions. Okay? So we'll play her presentation, and then we'll have her live.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this slightly unusual talk. Let me start by thanking Christina and the organizers of the conference for inviting me to speak and for accommodating my inability to travel. And thank you all for listening to this talk in this virtual format. I want to apologize in advance for any technical infelicities. There's story time happening behind me, and I'll try, therefore, to keep it both brief and free of interruptions. But if the camera angles are imperfect, then you'll have to bear with me. I should also say that I wasn't entirely sure what the spoiler policy was, so with one notable exception towards the end of the talk, I steered clear of any detailed exposition of the show's last ongoing season. Okay, so we can start. The sublime is a slippery concept, one that is easier to recognize in action than it is to define. It is also a concept with a long history of interpretation, so that the sublime has gathered its own galaxy of related ideas: grandeur, excess, elevation, and shock, all in the attempt to put words to the feeling one gets when in the presence of something that makes you feel suspended on the edge of what is possible to feel. The sublime, in other words, is that mist breath just beyond one's powers of description, and as such deals in more paradoxical moments of human expression, at once too much and not enough to account for our engagement with the world. Over its long interpretive history, the sublime, or more precisely sublimity, have been ascribed to a whole variety of objects: gods, whether pagan or Christians, storms, heroes in full flight, language, poetry, and in some cases even so little an object as the Greek particle t, but not, so far as I know, ever to the cultural object that brought us all together here today, namely Game of Thrones. And yet Game of Thrones is precisely the kind of work, in both the books and the television shows, that deals in some of the same paradoxes that the sublime brings to the fore. Game of Thrones, after all, is very much concerned with size, excess, actions both improbable and beyond comprehension, whether for their banality or for their staggering ambition. And above all, Game of Thrones is obsessed by the slow process of destruction and disintegration, environmental, political, physical, and moral, and the various human responses to them. Do these make Game of Thrones sublime, though? And what would it actually mean to think about sublimity in Game of Thrones? This is not an entirely straightforward question, not least because sublimity often connotes to us a certain aesthetic quality, and there is a long-standing and widespread debate over whether Game of Thrones is good or not as a work of art. For both written and televised versions, flaws have been noted in its character development, its plot construction, the writing style, and so forth. These obstacles can be got around, if one were so inclined, by pointing out that sublimity is a quality that pertains typically to moments rather than to whole works. Although he supplies critics with many paradigmatic examples of the sublime, even Homer proverbially nodded, and while some parts of Game of Thrones may be cringeworthy, others are not. More fundamentally, refusing to apply certain aesthetic categories to popular works buys into unthinking assumptions about the practice of criticism, namely that the mere fact of popularity places constraints on what is appropriate to think of a work. Furthermore, the supposed aesthetic unevenness of Game of Thrones may make it particularly effective a case study in the sublime, since the corollary of the sublime is the ridiculous or the pathetic, and it is in part through the juxtaposition of these qualities that each is thrown into relief and emerges as a more recognizable concept. For the purposes of this talk, however, I want to take as my entree into the sublime not so much a specific definition of the aesthetic, which is notoriously and perhaps necessarily slippery, but rather the sublime's association with a particular genre, namely epic. As already noted, Homeric epic exemplified the sublime for certain ancient critics, such as Longinus, and recent classical scholarship, in particular by Philip Hardy, has focused on Virgil's Aeneid and Lucretius's philosophical epic as illustrative of various core concepts of the sublime. Game of Thrones, I suggest, fulfills many of the same functions as epic poetry across different periods and cultures. Indeed, the description I gave earlier of Game of Thrones' interest, a paroxysm of violence and human responses to them, is characteristic precisely of ancient poetry. Of ancient epic poetry, that is. But also, like epic, Game of Thrones narrates the story of a foundational war. It unifies a large community of viewers who would otherwise have little to do with each other, and it provides popular entertainment that resonates with some of the bigger issues society grapples with, all of which are functions epic poetry fulfilled for its own contemporary audience. One of the questions Game of Thrones poses for classicists is how intentional the resemblance to epic is, and by extension, what bearing this resemblance might have on interpretation. How can we find the classics in Westeros, and having found them, can we ever be sure that we were not the ones to put them there in the first place? This is a tricky question to answer, but one for which the sublime is a useful start. One of the crucial points made by Jim Porter in his seminal book, The Sublime in Antiquity, a book as long as a volume of Game of Thrones and with much longer footnotes, is that the sublime, at least for Longinus, its most famous ancient expounder, was a literary and constructive effect. In other words, it was a deliberate result of reading certain texts in a certain way, and was therefore as much a product of interpretation or of the reader's engagement with the text than some fixed or inherent quality of the text or the object described. This point is important because it means in part that the sublime is one of the ideas that help us define and describe the pleasure or interest that we take in any work of art, the unknown quantity that makes us reopen the book or turn our screens on week after week after week. In other words, it is a concept that celebrates interpretation and which thrills at finding in the work of art resonances and encounters with whole galaxies of other texts, works and authors similarly construed as sublime. In what follows, therefore, I want to offer some instances of literary interpretation, suggesting that Game of Thrones, in both book or show format, or indeed as a composite of both forms, can profitably be read as a prose epic, or at least as sharing or remixing some plot lines or ideas that belong properly in ancient epic. And that thinking about sublimity, about the moment beyond expression, can help us make sense of some of the frustrations and exaltations that go along with this kind of reading. Further, if, as I suggest, Game of Thrones shares some of its aesthetic sensibility with ancient epic, then this convergence invites us to think in an epic, indeed sublime mode, which interrogates some of our fundamental assumptions about heroism, masculinity and femininity, the aesthetics of battle, and indeed our practices of reading themselves. With all that in mind, let's start with one of the places in Game of Thrones where I see reading and the sublime as most intimately intertwined. As it happens, Game of Thrones is a fairly self-reflective work. The title of the book series, A Song of Ice and Fire, already hints at the importance of song culture, especially for the transmission of cultural capital. And it would be fair to say, I think, that much of the early plot of Game of Thrones is driven by the inability of young people to celebrate song from reality, or perhaps better to say, the failure of reality to follow the template laid out by heroic song. Thus, for instance, Sansa is unable to wrap her head around the fact that Joffrey and the Lannisters might be out to destroy her family, simply because Joffrey is beautiful and a prince. And the songs she had been reared on taught her that beauty is good and good is beauty, itself a Greek principle of the kalos kai agathos that celebrated the elite by establishing the congruence of beautiful forms and good morals. And Sansa is not the only one. Loras Tyrell, Renly Baratheon, and Brienne of Tarth all start out as bright-eyed youth seeking to find glory on earth by following the template of song. They are the Knights of Summer, and winter is coming, says Catelyn Stark, and Brienne, one of the few to survive long enough to see the devastation of Westeros in the wake of the War of the Five Kings, replies, "Winter will never come for the likes of us. Should we die in battle, they will surely sing of us, and it's always somewhere in the songs." The exchange is itself epic in nature. The heroes of the Iliad talk consciously about their desire to be immortalized in song, should they die gloriously at Troy. For Sansa, as for all the other characters, their world is a world of fiction and song, and they have been remembered, indeed are in the process of being iconized, by virtue of being characters in a drama too large for any one of them to encapsulate alone. This is a fairly standard point in literary criticism, that characters are often aware of their own fictiveness. But the specific expressions evoke epic in particular, notably the Homeric characters of Hector and Helen, who imagine themselves as a subject known to posterity and treated as a famous point of reference. Furthermore, and this point is less familiar, Martin's language also evokes a Longinian idea of the sublime, one that is grounded in practices of quotation and interpretation on the one hand, and on the other in a thematics of paradox, by which I mean that Brienne's speech, for instance, is elevating, even as it bespeaks a fundamental naivety. It implicitly points to the inevitable lessons to be learned by a generation coming of age, only to discover the falsity of the code on which they have been raised. But in flying against that future, her utterance stakes a claim to agency, exceptionalism, and a defiance of human limitation. Sansa's and Brienne's concept of song and its application to their world enables the reader to hear a different set of notes that sound in counterpoint to the constant background noise of suffering and destruction. In response to Catelyn's worldly realism and Brienne's romanticism, we, the readers, now situated at an inflection point between wildly different consciousnesses, experience the end of the world as the young know it, an experience that will shortly become their own. The sublime is often an exercise in transgressing boundaries, and there is perhaps no more pronounced a boundary in all of Westeros than the wall. It is also a monument ripe for sublimity. So vast that it forces anyone who sees it to stop and marvel, the wall stands as a physical embodiment of the vertiginous feeling of looking above and looking beyond. Here it is again worth restating the point, made extensively by Porter, that the sublime inheres in the interpretation as much as the object. The wall is an artificial boundary, not a natural one, and its sublimity lies in our surprised gasp of appreciation as much as in how it invites us to think about its size and its function. And so it is perhaps not surprising that Season 7 ended on what Longinus would almost certainly have recognized as a sublime moment of transgressed boundaries. A dragon, itself a species brought back from extinction, brought back from the dead to break through a literal barrier between the dead and the living, realizing an elemental battle between fire and ice that literally defines the entire artwork. The wall, of course, is also a particularly classical moment in a more straightforward way, since it is one of the few, if not the only structure in Westeros that is explicitly marked by J.R.R. Martin as inspired by the classical world. And I quote, "The world predates anything else. I can trace back the inspiration for that to 1981. I was in England visiting a friend, and as we approached the border of England and Scotland, we stopped to see Hadrian's Wall. I stood up there and I tried to imagine what it was like to be a Roman legionary, standing on this wall looking at these distant hills. It was a very profound feeling. For the Romans at that time, this was the end of civilization. It was the end of the world. We know that there were Scots beyond the hills, but they didn't know that. It could have been any kind of monster. It was the sense of this barrier against dark forces. It planted something in me. But when you write fantasy, everything is bigger and more colorful. So I took the wall and made it 3 times as long and 700 feet high and made it out of ice. Now, I'm not especially interested in analyzing the classical credentials of Martin himself, but I do want to note that he uses the word profound, which is not a world away from sublime, to discuss the feeling he gets when he imagines the feeling of a Roman soldier on Hadrian's wall. This again, we might say, fits in well within the ancient sublime. Longinus, for instance, regularly cite passages describing distance and viewing from a distance. But more important than distance alone is the response it evokes, a feeling of profundity brought on by an encounter with what lies beyond, a feeling we get when we try to imagine another person's feeling. I said already that there was no more pronounced boundary than the wall, but there are in fact a number of different boundaries intersecting already in Martin's description of it. He says that nothing predates the wall, but of course something and someone must, since the wall was built by someone, Brandon the builder, and for a purpose, to stop the White Walkers. What Martin means, I think, is that the wall marks a mythological horizon, much as the Trojan War does for the Greek and Romans. Before the wall, there is only legend, while after the war, there is history, politics, the deeds of men and women, and the recording of them. But other than a physical barrier against the undead, the wall is also a repository of knowledge, the last great library that might contain the secret of defeating the White Walkers. The wall is also one of the few buildings in Westeros for which we have a date. It is 8,000 years old, and as such, it is also a place of history and of learning, a boundary between saving knowledge and doomed ignorance. In fact, the wall makes an unlikely pairing with the other place of learning in Westeros, the Citadel deep in the southwest of the Reach, where scholars earn the links in their chain by mastering branches of knowledge. Both the wall and the Citadel are manned by what we might call a monastic order, men who have pledged their lives to their work and disavowed either political interest or domestic fulfillment. But on the wall, the quest for knowledge is conducted not with books or incantations, but with toil and courage. The masters of the Citadel expand their knowledge right where they are. The rangers of the wall expand theirs by going out and having a look. Autopsy and inquiry therefore bracket Westeros, leaving the middle ground empty for knights and kings to battle out their lives. What matters, however, is that Westeros is bounded, for better and for worse, by places that combine sublimity with reading and with knowledge, just as the songs that define the culture of A Song of Ice and Fire. If there is a reaching beyond the ordinary, I suggest, it is one born out of a movement between text reading and lived experience, as the various characters of Game of Thrones scramble to fit their lives into a set of templates in constant flux, and more importantly, under the constant threat of disruption and reconstitution. Besides shared content and aesthetics, Game of Thrones' resemblance to epic also rests on what might be termed intertextual or elusive gestures. Given the series' creators, we should not be surprised. The story of Troy, which preoccupies much of the ancient epic tradition, is a good example, as David Benioff, who showruns Game of Thrones, also wrote the screenplay for Wolfgang Petersen's Troy back in 2004. Classicists tend to scoff at Troy, but the film deserves credit, to my mind, for one of the very few cinematic appearances of Rome's best beloved hero, their mythical ancestors, Aeneas, who appears on screen as a young man eager to receive the hallowed Sword of Troy from Orlando Bloom's Paris. This is the very moment I start my Roman history class with, because however kitsch or ill-informed, this moment captures exactly the moment when the Romans insert themselves into history. The original Aeneas, the Greek Aeneas, Homer's Aeneas, doesn't know anything about Rome. But thanks to Virgil, this Aeneas, Benioff's and the Romans, and our Aeneas, know exactly that his job is to leave the burning city of Troy, lead his people to safety, and build a new homeland and a new life for them on the shores of the river Tiber, where in the fullness of time they can realize their destiny and become Romans. Classical allusion in Game of Thrones, a non-classical work, naturally tends to operate in less direct ways. In the 5th season of the show, Stannis Baratheon, one of the contenders to the Iron Throne and not generally a feeling man, orders the burning alive of his daughter Shireen. The scene is generally considered one of the most horrific and gut-wrenching of an already horror-soaked show, not only because it depicts the senseless sacrifice of a little girl by her own parents, which is bad enough, but because the scene is not in book canon, and therefore not really necessary to film, at least not from a strictly originalist principle. The scene, which was originally written for Troy, and as many have already pointed out in details, is inspired by the Greek playwright Euripides in a play called Iphigenia in Aulis, which is set when the Greek army is assembling in Aulis in preparation for crossing the sea for the Trojan War. The details line up. 2 armies stranded by the weather, 2 generals fretting over their military campaigns, and 2 daughters burned and sacrificed to appease the weather and allow a war to proceed. And to confirm our suspicions, and I'm borrowing here from Amanda Marcotte's piece in Slate, when Shireen is let out, she is clutching a stag figurine, a symbol of her house, but also perhaps a reference to an alternative version of the myth of Iphigenia, where she is saved by the goddess Artemis at the last moment and is replaced by a great stag. In other words, the question of classical encounters in Game of Thrones is determined partially by where you look and what you read, but as I hope to show in some important cases, many of which marked by moments of sublimity, if not of classical quotation, the classical epic also provides template and ideas through which Game of Thrones can develop some of its major themes and ideas. One of those ideas that Game of Thrones consistently explores, indeed one of the things it excels at, is heroism and the heroic story template. And here I want to touch on the one major spoiler, which is the story of Daenerys Targaryen. I also want to note that I am not here talking about characterization, since the Game of Thrones book, while the Game of Thrones book do a very creditable job at character development, the HBO show has demonstrably not quite been able to follow Martin's lead, partially due to pacing and scope, and partially due to more endemic problems with the representation of women. Still, it is precisely the representation of women that I want to dwell on, because for better or worse, Game of Thrones remains one of the few cultural phenomena that not only explores, but in fact centers strong female characters, and which in fact makes it a point of placing these women in a number of different scenarios. Especially as the story progresses, we see women move from the traditional damsel in distress, think of Sansa early on, to more traditionally masculine roles. They are ruler queens and warriors who, for all that they struggle with ubiquitous misogyny, nevertheless exercise considerable authority in their own rights. These are not, needless to say, the traditional roles of women in ancient epic, or indeed in ancient literature, with the notable exception of the Amazons, on whom Brienne of Tarth and Arya Stark are partially modeled, and of the grand dames of Greek drama and Roman history, whose power, by and large, are severely restricted to the domestic scene. Ancient literary women tend to exist in the background, or as objects around which men can organize their pursuit of fame. Helen of Troy is a good example of that. Famed for her beauty, and in some cases her witch-like ability with potions, she is nevertheless reducible to the wife of a wronged husband, the excuse for the cataclysm that was the Trojan War, and, according to Herodotus, an item in an exchange of mutual rapes that structures the antagonism between West and East. Lyanna Stark plays much the same role for Game of Thrones, a faceless beauty whose main role is to launch the war and enable the domestic drama of the Starks. And this, too, we might note, is an element of the sublime, a beauty whose greatest value is in both being seen and in being invisible. Seen to be admired as a bit of capital, unseen so as to preserve countless lives. Cersei Lannister, too, starts out in a similar role. She is the most beautiful woman in the land, a prize for the new king to celebrate his victory and console him for the loss of his true love. As a royal woman, Cersei's world is as competitive as that of the men at court. where they compete in jousting and drinking, the women of the court compete in the parlaying of beauty and pedigree into social capital, that is, a good marriage. Cersei knows that her beauty is an important asset, and is constantly worried about the ravages of age, especially against the advent of younger and more beautiful women like Sansa Stark or Margaery Tyrell, the latter of whom Cersei sees as direct competition. But as power shifts in King's Landing, and Cersei struggles out from under the power of her husband, father, uncle, and brothers, she begins increasingly to abuse her power until she reproduces, whether deliberately or not, the tyrannical conduct of her son Joffrey. This is essentially a masculine, or more precisely masculinizing, plot. Cersei's development requires that she behave in increasingly masculine ways, and in the course of doing so, she is also responsible for some of the greatest atrocities in Game of Thrones. The explosion of the Great Sept remained, until last week's episode, the deadliest event in the series, exceeding in body count any of the big battle pieces, and embroiling Cersei both in the kind of cataclysmic filicide that exceeds even Medea, or closer to home, in the remorseless violence of the cold-blooded Tywin. As appropriate for a twin always jealous of the privileges afforded her twin brother Jaime, Cersei's development pushes her to exceed her menfolk in the casual abuse of violence and state power. And this process is marked throughout by moments whose aesthetics, especially that of fire, reprise the most horrific aspects of sublimity, the disbelief that there exists yet another boundary to transgress. Now, while I think most people would agree that Cersei is an important protagonist in the story of Game of Thrones, she is not heroic, either in the colloquial modern sense of the word, by which I mean that she is not a morally upstanding person, nor especially brave, nor prone to self-sacrifice or inclined towards the common good, nor in a sense applicable to ancient epic, in that she is neither a martial protagonist nor a divinized figure. Her story is more properly that of drama, with its focus on the claustrophobic confines of royal court scheming. By contrast, Daenerys Targaryen hews much more closely to an epic type, despite the fact that she and Cersei have much in common. They are both women in a man's world, they are both willing to act drastically and without remorse, and their stories, like indeed those of most women in the saga, are those of rewriting masculine roles and acquiring powers more usually reserved for men. In Dany's case, when I say rewriting, I mean it quite literally, since the Targaryen plotline is in many important aspects also the story of Virgil's Aeneid and of Rome more broadly. If the Wall is the place we can find antiquity most alive in the present day of Westeros, Old Valyria is the place where we find it buried in the mist of historical time. We don't know much about Valyria, but what we do know resembles very much the Roman Republic, an empire presided over by a city-state, which in turn was ruled by competing aristocratic families. Nor are the Targaryens the only thing that survives the Doom. The physical remains of the Valyrian Empire are scattered all over Essos and resemble very much the physical remain of the Roman Empire. Roads, arenas, and the language of High Valyrian, which, much like Latin, remained as a language of culture and erudition. It's one of the tokens, for instance, separating Tyrion from Joffrey Lannister. Further, when Dany reaches Slaver's Bay, she unknowingly also visits an important piece of her own ancestral history. For the Giscari, a slave trader nation that very much resembles Rome's ancient enemy Carthage, are said to have suffered a unique punishment by their long-standing rivals, the Valyrians. Their land was plowed with salt. An apocryphal tradition tells us that this is exactly what the Romans did to Carthage, although there is no actual evidence to support this, so that Dany's action in Slaver's Bay twists history back on itself twice over. The Giscari outlast their own Romans, only to be conquered in the end by a remnant of the long-buried past. Slaver's Bay is therefore a natural place for Dany finally to reinvent herself as something of a living paradox, both as a remorseless wielder of her dragons and as the benevolent liberator of slaves. and it is appropriate too that here was the first glimpse of the mad dragon queen in something of a nascent sublime. She unleashed fire and blood on her enemies, but her violence could still be excused, and her power is still embedded in her plot of self-discovery. Now, if old Valyria resembles Rome, it resembles also Rome's literary counterpart, Troy, and the story of the Targaryen revival is also the story of the departures from Troy, specifically that of Aeneas, the mythical founder of the Roman people, who crossed the Mediterranean in search of a new homeland. Now, new homeland is, of course, a paradox, and a necessary one in order to make the story of Aeneas one of a return rather than one of colonialism and conquest. This tension animates the Aeneid, and it animates too the story of the Targaryens right from its inception, when Aegon the Dragon, the founder of the dynasty, crosses the water from a doomed burning city to find a new home for his people, at considerable cost to the local people of Westeros. His descendant Daenerys lives her own Aeneas story in trying to do exactly the same thing, find a new home in a mythical land she knows is her birthright, but which she doesn't really know or understand. Along the way, Aeneas and Daenerys show any number of similarities. They both have a tendency to blunder, a casual attitude to the opposite sex, a father figure who keeps sending them in not quite the right direction, and children, or in Daenerys' case, children, who behave in problematic ways and land everyone in trouble. But Daenerys reverses the story of the Aeneid in a number of interesting ways, not only in swapping the gender from male to female, but also, for example, in arriving in Westeros at the head of 1,000 ships. Like Helen, she launches 1,000 ships, but she is the driving force rather than the retrieved object of the fleet's expedition. But I want to focus here on one important point of similarity, and that is the potential for madness that has always lurked within Daenerys and which has taken critics of the Aeneid by surprise. Like Aeneas, who brings from the ruins of Troy his father, son, and his household gods, Daenerys too has to bring a token of survival over from the old country to the new, and that token is her dragons, the traditional emblem of her house and the means by which she has secured her survival all along. Rather than just superior air power, the dragons, like the Penates, represent something fundamental about the old, now lost world, and about the people who used to live in it and their relationship to the new nation. They are, in some sense, a living embodiment of Targaryen madness, just as Aeneas' household gods are physical embodiments of his famous piety. But even Aeneas' famous piety has an end, or perhaps better to say, can only be pushed so far before it too becomes terrible in revenge. His final act in the epic that bears his name, which is also the very end of the poem, is to kill his enemy Turnus, an enemy who has just offered him unconditional surrender. Just as Daenerys, whose potential for madness and cruelty has been an ongoing subject of discussion in Game of Thrones, decides to raise King Landing even as the city's bells are ringing out to signal its own surrender to the Dragon Queen. Both Aeneas and Daenerys reach their lapse of reason and civility after long hesitation, and both are prompted by the death of a dear companion. Turnus is wearing armor he is taking off the body of Aeneas' ward Pallas, while Dany has just witnessed the execution of Missandei. The end of the Aeneas has long troubled scholars, who have felt that Aeneas reverts to a violent stereotype rather than learning from his experiences. Just as many reactions on social media and commentary sites have reacted with great frustration at this development in Dany's characters. There is in fact a letter writing campaign to have the writers redo this last episode. So it is particularly interesting to see what will happen in the show's finale, which gives us an opportunity for closure Virgil never allows us. But madness, especially momentary madness, is a condition with great potential for sublimity. Madness requires a stepping out beyond the normal confines of experience, and the descriptions of it are frequently both deeply embodied and have an out-of-body quality to them. a slow motion description, and heightened focus on detail, and a revving up of emotional affect and disbelief. But there is yet another aspect to the sublimity of the moment, and that is also something that Game of Thrones shares with the epic, which is an invitation to revisit our fundamental assumptions about what is good and what is bad, what is moral and what is expedient, and above all, what we expected to happen all along. We are frustrated, either with the end of the Aeneid or with Game of Thrones, because it constantly and continually frustrates our expectations. Good people suffer, redemption is nullified by events, and, at least in the show, one gets the feeling that the special effects sometimes overshadow the development of story and character. But what attracts me as a classicist to these moments is precisely the disorienting effect they produce, through which one can see the continued relevance of the classics and of literature on the way we consume even the most popular of stories. The Sublime, therefore, offers a way to structure some of the encounters of Game of Thrones in the classics, encounters which are characterized both by the disorienting effect of discovering a perhaps unexpected similarity, and also by having an important local effect within the fabric of Game of Thrones itself. Moments of sublimity, and the catalogue I have offered is far from complete, both give shape to the physical landmass of Westeros, help structure its historical time, and punctuate some of the most atrocious moments of the war. Thank you.
Okay, now let's see whether this works for questions. Hi, Ayelet, can you hear us?
Hey,
Hey.
I can see some of you, but yes.
Great. So, is there any questions about it?
Not all at once.
It's coming. Ponte aquí, Rosa. La cámara está aquí.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your paper. It was fascinating. All the time I was thinking about the Aeneid, but the other way around. I was thinking about Jon Snow as being this kind of feeble hero, and of Daenerys being a kind of new Dido, but because she's a queen that has made herself and has overcome lots of troubles, etc. But your perspective is really, really, really fresh and interesting, because it makes us see the parallelism the other way around, and your explanation is quite satisfying for me. We wish more people had read the Aeneid, etc., so that they could be not so much dissatisfied. So it was more a comment than a question. Thank you so much. It was really, really interesting for me.
Oh, thank you. One of the things I didn't really have time to talk about is how is the way that Game of Thrones really sort of plays with this idea of feeble heroism. I mean, Jon Snow is very representative. The only sort of real hero, Jaime, is kind of a has-been. And so we get people like Tyrion who are actually fighting and actually get to be heroic. And that's really an interesting aspect of Game of Thrones. It doesn't let you just sort of relax into expected norms. It kind of makes you
see it fail and have to be reinvented all the time, which I think is one of its better features.
Thank you. More questions? Someone wants to come here to the front?
Well, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us and answer our questions. It's very early over there. It's evening here. And I have to say that I really like the treatment or the reflection on the innate, because I wonder, I mean, it's a question more about the last episode, because the innate at the end is a tragic beginning of a city. And I don't know if we might see a parallel, or what is your opinion about what is going to happen this Sunday, or if you have a guess about it. I know it's not a fair question, but I think that it works really well, what you said about the innate and what we are seeing now. I don't know if we might be facing the beginning of something, the founding of something new. What do you think?
I have many predictions about the end are wrong. So I think well, I'm not sure the sacking of city stands commonplace in poetry, and it's usually followed by a period of collective mourning and some attempt of pulling everything back together. But a lot of the time, what we see is a very hollow repair. Someone comes in from the outside and sort of tries to patch everything together. I'm not. There's something appealing for Game of Thrones about this kind of when there's some ending that doesn't satisfy anyone and has sort of external agent come in from the outside. Someone on Twitter mentioned the best ending would be the Bank of Bravos coming in to collect its debt and demanding payment. So that might be a good way out. But honestly, it's so unpredictable at this point that I'm not really sure what is going to happen. But I guess we just have to watch. Yeah. I mean, in my book, just one useful way of thinking about Game of Thrones, thinking about it like Tacitus and the Civil War of '69, where basically you have 5 different contenders all verging in on Rome. The city burns, and then a new dynasty starts. So on that logic, we should see, Stark, who I guess are the only people left standing, take the Iron Throne, or what's left of it, and kind of start anew. And I think that could be interesting. I would like Stark to take charge, but that's a personal preference.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Somebody else want to ask a question? Preguntas? Thank you.
Hi, Ayelet. I was intrigued by how you describe very well how for some characters at the beginning, I mean, they believe in those songs, such as Sansa or Brienne, and how have you explained how they have their expectations and hopes shattered. Whereas in the case of Brienne, I mean, they're rather like fulfilled, and actually in her arc, her idea of chivalry and song, actually it's real, whereas in the case of Sansa, it's completely shattered. No? So I wanted some thoughts from you regarding that question.
Brienne's an interesting character, but I mean, on some level, she's right. Right? She is sort of celebrated in these books. She becomes one of the stars, which she clearly hadn't expected. So um, she sets out on this quest for glory, and she gets what she wanted. Whether or not she finds it satisfying, I think, is a more interesting question. It's not what she imagined. Right? She imagined a more romantic, sort of novel-esque adventure where she and Renly ride off into the sunset, and then later on, she and James might have something going on. All of that collapses around her, and all of her success is very sort of self-reliant. So she in some ways finishes the same way she started. Um, she's still on her own. She's still not quite getting what she wants. The world around her has changed, but I don't know um, if she thinks that's a good thing. So, I mean, in some ways, she's a very feminist character, but in other ways, she also kept a bit. I've always felt a bit flat. I don't know. I always find her quite as developed as it should be. I think her story is a different kind of disappointment, but she is right on the basic premise that if you go out there and fight the good fight and stick it out, then people write songs about you. And George Martin has written, 4 books. Um, so in that sense, I think she succeeds. Whether she's emotionally fulfilled, I think we'll see. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, sure. Um, any final questions? No? No? Well, then thank you very much again, Ayelet, for being available so early at your time zone
Thank you all
and for your presentation. Thank you very much.
through the video. Yeah, have a wonderful afternoon. I'm sure you're having much more fun than I am.